So, we all know what World War II is, or at least that it happened here. But what about here? Japan was also a part of the war, but it was feeling a little left out by all this European fighting, and it really wanted to do some fighting closer to the home front, and that is how the Pacific War, a theater within World War II, began. Historians are in disagreement about when exactly the Pacific War started, because there are lots of different points where it could have started depending on how you look at it, but I'm going to begin my timeline in 1937 so that you have all the context you need to make sense of the Pacific War. 1937. Japan is in control of Manchuria, China, and figures it's time for them to take over some more Chinese land. So they try to invade Shanghai in August, which failed, and then they try to take over Nanking, now Nanjing, the capital city, in December, which is a huge success. So successful that they thought it would be appropriate for them to commit some of the worst war crimes ever committed against the Chinese people by killing and raping civilians en masse. Wait, did I say successful? That's actually pretty awful. Anyway, right before they massacred an estimated 40,000 to 300,000 Chinese peoples, Japan attacked the U.S. gunboat Pan A, which was stationed just outside Nanking. The U.S. already wasn't the biggest fan of Japan at this point because the U.S. was friends with China, and Japan was kind of bullying China. Japan claimed they hadn't seen the boat's American flags and gave them some money to make up for it, but the U.S. was still pretty salty. America was just getting over the Depression at this point, so they weren't yet super involved in foreign affairs, but they kept their eyes on Japan anyway, just in case things got shady. 1940. By 1940, the U.S. had had enough of Japan trying to take over the entire world, so on July 2, 1940, President Roosevelt signed the Export Control Act, which meant that on July 31st, exports of aviation motor fuels and lubricants and No. 1 heavy melting iron and steel scrap were restricted. The British and Dutch followed suit soon after and put their own heavy sanctions on Japan. So now Japan has an oil shortage because it's a small island that doesn't have many resources of its own. This was a main motivation for Japanese expansionism. Then Germany and Italy send Japan a text or email or carrier pigeon or something like that asking if it wants to be friends because the three of them have so much in common. Japan accepts their friend request, and on September 27, 1940, Japan signs an alliance with Germany and Italy and becomes one of the Axis powers. 1941. Japan is still mad about those sanctions from the US, Britain, and the Dutch, so it comes up with a plan to spit all over them. These plans are called the Southern Plan and the Eastern Plan. Southern Plan. Objective. Seize economic resources in the Dutch East Indies, now Indonesia, and Malay, so that they could escape the troubles caused by the sanctions. This plan consisted of attacking Malay and Hong Kong, both British properties, attacking some other stuff, because why not, Bismarck Archipelago, Java, and Sumatra, and then isolating New Zealand and Australia, both Commonwealth countries. Eastern Plan. Objective. Piss off the U.S. This plan consisted of attacking U.S. military bases in Hawaii, Wake Island, and Guam, and seizing the Philippines. These plans were finalized in November 1941, and nobody could do anything about it or else Germany would come and beat them up. On December 7th, the day that most historians agree is the official beginning of the Pacific War, Japan starts carrying out its plan by attacking American bases in Hawaii. On the same day, but on the other side of the international date line, so December 8th, Japan does the following. Attacks Guam, Wake Island, and Hong Kong, invades the Philippines, Thailand, and Malaya, bombs Pearl Harbor. The Japanese had hoped that if they hit the U.S. in Pearl Harbor so quickly and so mercilessly, the U.S. would allow Japan free rein in Asia. Spoiler alert, the U.S. did not allow Japan free rein in Asia. The U.S. had been officially not at war, but they'd been helping out their UK homies with supplies the whole time and were like 1,000,000% not neutral on the matter, so the day after Pearl Harbor was bombed, they declared war on Japan, closely followed by the UK, Canada, the Netherlands, China, and Australia. 1942. Things went pretty well for Japan in the first 6 months of war. They basically just crushed everyone because they were way more experienced with battle than anyone else was. They found themselves in control of a pretty big area. The Allies decided it was time to get organized and form the Pacific War Council so they could really start messing Japan up. The U.S. bombed Tokyo during the Doolittle bombing, which did little damage. Doolittle did little damage. It's a pun. But the fact that enemy planes had gotten into airspace above the Emperor's Palace left the Japanese shocked and also mad. Because they were mad, plus they wanted to defend the area they'd gained, they decided to invade and occupy Port Moresby in New Guinea and Tulagi in the Solomon Islands, because it would let them strengthen their defensive positioning. On May 3, 1942, Japan successfully invaded Tulagi in the Battle of the Coral Sea. However, U.S. codebreakers had figured out this plan and intercepted the Japanese there. While it was technically a tactical win for the Japanese because they sank a lot of U.S. ships, it proved to be a strategic victory for the Allies because this was the first time in the war that they had intercepted the Japanese. Also, because of the damage done to the Japanese fleet by the US during this battle, the Japanese decided not to invade Port Moresby after all. Immediately following the Battle of the Coral Sea, the surviving Japanese fleet moved onward to Midway, a Hawaiian island. Japan was trying to spit on the US, round 2, but the US was prepared for it this time. Their codebreakers had determined the date/location of the planned attack, so the US forces planned their own ambush. The Battle of Midway took place between June 3rd and 7th, 1942, and Japan won! Wait, did I say they won? I meant that they lost. They lost pretty bad. The Japanese lost 4 of their largest aircraft carriers in exchange for sinking only 1 American carrier. There was pretty much no recovering from this loss, and it was a turning point in the Pacific War. 1943. Things basically started going seriously downhill from here as the Allies started chasing Japan back into Japan again, which made Japan very sad. Japan increased its aircraft production to keep up with the US, but they didn't have enough strong air crews for that to really be helpful. 1944. The last major carrier versus carrier battle between the US and Japan took place from June 19th to 20th, 1944, when Japan invaded the Mariana Islands. American aviators nicknamed this battle the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot because of how many Japanese pilots got shot down relatively easily for the US. Things just keep going downhill from here for the Japanese, and thousands of lives were lost. 1945. Everything changed on August 6, 1945, when the US dropped an atomic bomb on Hiroshima. Tens of thousands of people died from the initial blast, and many more died later from radiation exposure. Then, 3 days later, on August 9, 1945, the US bombed Nagasaki as well. In total, approximately 120,000 civilians died as a result of the bombs. Japan agreed to surrender on August 14, 1945, and the US began to occupy Japan. They formally surrendered on September 2, 1945, putting an end to the Pacific War. It is incredibly easy to say that the Pacific War was about the Allies, the US especially, fighting against the insane and militant Japanese expansionists, that it was this very simple good versus evil fight. But, of course, it wasn't really like that. Everything in war is complicated, and what you need to know about Japan to make sense of some of their seemingly senseless actions is this. In war times, it was a totalitarian dictatorship, so aggressive militarism and sentiments of nationalism and racial superiority were commonplace. Its military was also pretty much the only thing that hadn't gotten ravaged by the Great Depression, so once it was recovering from its economic collapse and wanted to make itself great again, using the military to do so seemed logical. Their police force had already had the power to arrest, torture, or kill anyone thought to be an enemy of the state, so abuse of power and lack of empathy from authority figures was normalized. Japan is not a very large country, and it was extremely difficult to keep up with the agricultural demands to feed their huge population. So, at least in my mind, a lot of their motivation for aggressive expansionism came from the need to feed their people. The US, and later Britain and the Netherlands, also imposed sanctions on Japan that seriously messed them up. And it's theorized that President Roosevelt, really wanted to be in the war, but his people didn't want him to, and he was like, guys, we should go to the war anyway. And his people were like, better not. So some historians argue that he was kind of just waiting around for Japan to attack him so that he could justify going into the war without the people being necessarily for it. So yes, history is complicated. That is my video. Goodbye.